Clear prop.
Star 73 Yankee number 2 following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic. This is our 80th episode, and we have crushed some big numbers in our world. We didn't know how big this thing was going to get, but last week we eclipsed the 50,000 downloads number. And if you read anything about podcast statistics and the number of people that listen to your show, that says we're in the top 2% of all podcasts. All podcasts. It's like Joe Rogan, then us, Wally. You think that's it?
Yeah.
Not quite in that realm, but top 2%, there's over 3 million shows out there. And I think that puts us in pretty good hands and a pretty good class of podcasters out there. So congratulations, Wally.
Yeah, well, same to you, Bobby. When you approached me about doing this, I had no idea what to expect. To say we'd be doing it 80 episodes down the road and no end in sight. I'm not looking at retirement. I don't think you are, but it's kind of cool to be out and about, maybe wearing something that has the logo on it, and somebody comes up to you and says, "Oh yeah, I listen to that podcast too." So it's kind of cool.
Yeah. I don't know if I told the story, but about a month ago now, a listener was in town in Houston from out of town and said he wanted to come by and see us, and he didn't know really where we lived or what we do, and it was the weekend, and I happened to be there, and he wanted to buy a coffee cup, but I gave him a coffee cup. So if you're a listener and you're ever in the area and you swing by the flight school, Bobby will give you a coffee cup if you swing by. I think it's so cool to talk to listeners and hear what they have to say. We know people are out there listening, but we don't ever really get to hear what you guys think and say. So as always, if you have ideas for shows, please send them our way. Give us the 5-star rating if you think we're earning it, and let us know how we're doing. We want to make it a great show for everybody and hopefully get in the top 1% in the next year or two for sure.
Yeah.
So we have a systems class today, Wally. We're going to talk about systems, and we're going to keep these refined to single-engine trainers, so Cessnas and Pipers and those sorts. We're not going to dive into a lot of other systems for aircraft like Cirrus or jets or other things that aren't really the norm in single-engine training worlds. But too many times I still hear common mistakes in the hallway at the flight school, misinterpretations of how systems work. I know we've recently had interaction on someone who failed to understand the heating system in a single engine aircraft, and we're passionate and I'm passionate about this. I know you are as well, but you're flying an aluminum can in the air at 3,000 feet. You really ought to know what's going on in that airplane. How the ventilation works, how the systems work, how the power works, how the thrust works, how the prop works. And I think I was disserviced by some of my CFIs who didn't make that a bigger point to me. And I think you should read the POH. I think you should understand the POH. And I think that's what we're going to talk through today is Chapter 7 of the Cessna and the Piper POH, and really just kind of talk through the systems, common mistakes, common errors, common misconceptions, and try and make all of the listeners a little bit smarter about the systems in their aircraft.
Yeah, August 31st, 1981, I took my first flying lesson, and that was a long time ago. But I distinctly remember walking in from the flight line into the office of the FBO and the flight school. And we went up to the counter where they had a little display counter, and my instructor saying, you need to buy 2 things. You need to buy a logbook, and you need to buy the POH for the airplane that we just flew, which was a Piper Tomahawk, a PA-38-112. And so I said, okay. So I bought a logbook, and I bought the book for the airplane, the POH for the airplane. I still have that POH today, by the way. And I remember him telling me, you need to read this book and you need to know everything in here. And I said, okay. And I went home and I started reading it. And to this day, I remember that a Piper Tomahawk has a 78-inch long propeller. Now, does that make me a better pilot? I really don't think so. But I know it. He told me to learn it, and I just said, okay, I'll learn it. And, I'm not sure people are doing that today. Now, one potential issue is, people may be learning to fly in 2 or 3 different models of 172. One day it may be in a 172N, maybe tomorrow a P model, the next day an S model. So that brings a little bit of a challenge. But again, the instructor ought to be talking about the differences, and the differences are extremely minor. But I don't think we get into really knowing what is going on. When we move that control surface, what are we moving? Am I moving the trim tab? Am I moving the elevator? Am I moving the whole stabilizer? What am I actually moving back there? And I think it's important to know that stuff. And it's a combination of reading, and it's a combination of experiencing it, going out and looking at the airplane. The last show we talked about hands-on experience. And so, how many people have looked at an engine that's uncowled and kind of looked around and, oh, that's what the vacuum pump looks like. That's what the alternator looks like. And things like that.
Yeah, I think my systems knowledge was one of memorization early on. And I'm assuming others out there listening can relate to some of this, but I can remember memorizing that I have an O320. It's a Lycoming engine. It has opposing cylinders. It's a 4-cylinder. It was all this stuff that if my DP asked me, I could recite these things. But I know for a fact that if my DP would have dove in one layer deeper, I would have been absolutely wrong. And a story that I tell often is I was on my check ride and my DP was observing me as I'm doing my walk around, and I'm doing, the hero walk around. Wally, you've probably observed many of these hero walk arounds, the 40-minute pre-flight to show that I know I'm checking everything. And it was a Cessna 172 N or P. I'm pretty sure it was a P model. And the DP said, how many fuel pumps does this airplane have? And I said 0. Because it was a carbureted aircraft, and I knew that fuel injected aircraft had a fuel pump, and that this plane did not have a fuel pump. And he literally laughed and said, "Oh yes, it does. It has one fuel pump." And I was like, "No, sir, I don't think it does." And here I am trying to challenge somebody that is examining me, but I really thought it didn't have a fuel pump because it wasn't fuel injected, and it had a carburetor, but it does have an engine-driven fuel pump. If it didn't have a fuel pump, how would the fuel get into the engine? So
right.
It's just not an electronic boost pump. And I think back to me thinking that I didn't have a fuel pump in my engine. How little did I really know back then? And many applicants I'm sure that you interact with, many students that I interact with, they do not understand systems at all. And
exactly.
Hopefully we give a little high level today. Hopefully we'll do more episodes. If you like these shows on systems, let us know, and we'll try and make them as interactive as we can. It wasn't too terribly long ago. And when I talk about systems, I mean, it is the knowledge about the system, of course, but it's how things work to make them work for you in the aircraft. And it wasn't too long ago that a gentleman was struggling to start an engine on my flight line as I pulled in, and I parked my truck, and I see him frantically walking towards me, and he was in a panic. Just so happened that he was on a check ride, and he says, "I can't get the plane started, Mr. Doss. I can't get the plane started. What should I do? What should I do?" And I was like, "Well, what do you think's wrong with it?" And I wasn't trying to increase his anxiety, but I didn't want to just give him the answer if he could learn from it, right? I look for these opportunities to help people learn. He goes, I don't know. And I said, well, let's go take a look. So I walk out there, and as I walk towards the aircraft, I see a puddle of fluid on the ground. And it's a warm, dry day in Houston that day. And I said, what is that liquid on the ground? Oh, it's water. It's water. I said, are you sure it's water? And I said, why don't you touch it and see what it feels like and if it has any smell to it? And he reached down and he goes, oh, it's gas. It's gas. It's gas. So do you think what do you think's going on in the engine? And I'm still trying not to make the guy panic too much, but trying to get him to learn a little something. And the engine was obviously flooded. And I asked him, do you know how to start an aircraft flooded? No, it's not on the checklist. It's not on the checklist. And of course, it's not on the paper checklist that's in our aircraft for normal procedures, but it's in the POH. There's how do I start a flooded engine is in the POH. I guarantee you. All POHs have that. And I told him, I said, I can start this engine for you if you want me to. I'm not sure how your DP is going to react about that, but I'll get it started. And he just didn't think it was going to start. And of course, it started on the first crank or two because I knew how to start a flooded engine. And when I'm talking systems, Wally, I'm talking the knowledge of those systems to understand how to make that aircraft work for you, because that could be a big deal one day if you don't know how the fuel system works, how to start a system, how to start the engine when it's flooded, or how to start it when it's hot, or how to start it when it's cold. That could make a big deal for you in your future. So long story short, system, I learned it. I knew it. I knew how to start it, started the engine, let it run for 10 seconds, killed it for him. No, the engine's no longer flooded. He was able to start the engine and ultimately had a successful check ride. But to know that he was on a commercial check ride and didn't know how to start a flooded engine did not make the flight school owner very happy that day.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. I mean, you could be at a remote airport somewhere. You've flown across country over there, and maybe there's no support. Maybe it's nighttime. Everybody's gone home. And you go to get in the airplane to come home, and you can't get it started. Then you drain the battery, and you're stuck. Okay,
yep.
So that's kind of a big deal to learn. I'm in my Saratoga. I've had the airplane for 3.5 years, and I'm still learning. And it's funny, the more I dive into it, the more I realize if I just follow the procedure in the POH, it works every time, almost every time. I'm on a cross-country flight, and I look up the performance numbers. Just last week, I flew a 2.5-hour cross-country flight, and I'm up at, I think I was at 11,000 feet, and I was looking at the numbers, and the true airspeed that I was supposed to get, I was a knot off. The fuel flow, I was right on. It's amazing. The information is right there in front of your face. You just got to look for it.
Yeah. So let's talk about the systems, and we're in Chapter 7 of a Cessna 172P model POH that we just found on the internet to use as a reference. And I'm also looking at a PA 28161 POH that's also Chapter 7. And I'll bounce back and forth as we talk about systems. I think they're going to be pretty similar across these two aircraft, one being a Cessna, one of them being a Piper. But this particular Cessna POH, it's got 35 pages of systems information. And obviously it's not going to make you a mechanic, but if you don't read these 35 pages, you're doing yourself a major disservice as a pilot to being a little bit more knowledgeable about the systems in your aircraft. And it kind of flows through from big to small in buckets as well, but starts airframe, flight controls, instrument panel, ground controls, and then kind of goes through each of the systems that helps the airplane fly and some of the comfort things inside the aircraft. And we're just going to jump around a little bit. Wally, I'll ask you first, and I know you have a favorite, but where do you think your applicants struggle with the most as it relates to aircraft systems in a Cessna or a Warrior?
I would say environmental and electrical. They've gotten better, but I feel like they understand the systems, but the practical application of what to do in the air when a systems malfunction happens comes into question. And I can't say there are right answers. I mean, I should say I can't say there are wrong answers. In other words, you're flying along and you have an indication of an alternator failure. What do you do? Well, I think the right answer is it depends. You can't just say, well, you're always going to do A or B or C. Are you going to continue on to the destination if it's 2 hours away? Well, that might be the best course of action, even though you know your battery, very good chance that the battery will go dead. I don't know. There could be a scenario where that is the best course of action. Suppose your destination is 30 minutes away. Should you divert to the airport that is right below you? I don't know. They're all, and you could make the argument that they're all right, but if you understand what the system is, and if you do go into a total electrical failure, what are you going to lose, and can we still land the airplane safely at our airport of intended destination? And, I just want, I like to see the applicant think through these things and say, well, I'm not going to do option A because of this and this and this. I kind of like option B. Option C might be a choice, but it's between B and C, and I'm thinking C might be better because of this. I like to hear the logic of why they're why they're choosing what they want to do. But the right answer is not always just to divert.
And we've done a whole episode on electrical failures or alternator failures, and go back and search and find that if you want to listen to that. Out of those two systems you mentioned, electrical and environmental, one of those is easier than the other or has fewer components, right? The environmental system has a lot fewer components.
Right.
And if you look in the Cessna POH, it's a figure 7.8 in the version that I'm looking at here. 10 pages in. It's actually page 31, 7-31. This is it's got 4 paragraphs total on the cabin heating, ventilation, and defrosting system. And you look at this, and it is the most basic drawing in the world. It tells you where all the air comes from inside the cockpit. It shows an example of the inlet for the air that actually becomes heated, and it has colored arrows that shows what is vented air, heated air, and blended air. And this, if you read these 4 paragraphs and looked at this picture, you should know pretty much where all the moving parts are and where all the air flows through a Cessna. And I bet there's a very similar drawing in the PA-28 book as well. But you recently had an experience where an applicant didn't know this system very well. You remember that?
Yeah. And I asked the applicant about how does the heater work? And the answer I got after kind of prodding a little bit was it's filtered exhaust air. And I said, really? So we're taking exhaust air, we're taking exhaust, and we're running it through a filter, and that's what we're breathing? And the response I got was, yeah, that just doesn't sound right, because I was telling my father about it, and he said that didn't sound right. But yeah, that's the way I understand it. And that's not anywhere close. Well, I guess close. I mean, there is an exhaust element to this, but that's certainly. I mean, we're not breathing filtered exhaust air in the cabin of an airplane.
And that's what's neat about this picture is it kind of shows the air is coming from outside. It does show an exhaust muffler shroud, and that might not make sense to people that aren't mechanics or that don't understand what a shroud is. A A shroud is a can. In this case, it's a can on the outside of the muffler or the exhaust pipe, where there obviously is heat in the exhaust gas leaving the airplane, and that shroud is wrapped around it, but it's not getting any of that exhaust in it. It's just capturing the heat around that pipe and turning that outside air into warmer air, and it goes through a pipe that gets to the inlets, for no better term, of the aircraft cabin, but there's a flap that you either let that in or you don't let that in. And so that flap that is controlled inside the aircraft by the cabin heat control is either open or closed. And I can tell you, I've gotten in a plane on a hot summer day where someone had pulled that cabin heat knob out, and I started that aircraft, and it got really, really hot really, really quick. A warm engine on a hot summer day will make that cockpit even hotter, and you want to know where that cabin heat control is so you can close that off. But it's more about the knowledge of knowing what you're closing off. And then I ask all the time when I walk past a Cessna with a new pilot, what is this flap on the co-pilot side or the CFI side of the aircraft? What does this flap do? And more often than not, they reach up and want to pull on it. And I'm like, don't do that, because you could break the cable. But that's the cabin inlet. I'm either opening it or closing it to let cabin air into the cockpit. And it's probably a 3-foot cable that's controlling that, maybe not even 3 foot, that's allowing you from inside. And you go and you open that door and you pull that knob back and forth and you watch that door open and close. People are like, that's where the air's coming from. Like, you should know that if you're a pilot. And if it's freezing at night on a cool winter day, you want to probably close that flap with the control inside the cockpit to make sure that you're not letting a lot of cold air into the aircraft as well.
Yeah, it's really a very simple system. And, when I'm teaching, I will tell people, I say, have you ever ridden a motorcycle or a mini bike? And most people have, they're familiar with it. Maybe they haven't ridden one. And I say, if you've ever ridden one wearing short pants, has your leg ever touched the exhaust pipe? And everybody gets a look on their face and they say, oh, yeah, I've done that. And I go, what happens? It burns your leg. That exhaust pipe is hot. Well, all we're doing in an airplane, we're taking that exhaust pipe and then we're putting another pipe called a shroud. And again, shroud is a word that I have probably never used in everyday just communication. Probably the only time I've ever used the word shroud is talking about this. But it's a pipe around a pipe or a can around a pipe. And then we're taking that air that is in that little chamber, which is being heated up by the exhaust pipe, and we're plumbing it into the cabin. And what is the downside of that? Well, the downside of that is, what if a hole or a leak develops within the exhaust itself that is within that shroud? Now we could potentially be venting exhaust into the cabin. Now the good news is that you would probably smell the exhaust. But carbon monoxide in and of itself is odorless, colorless, and tasteless. So you're not, but when you get exhaust, you get other gases, and you're probably going to smell them. Most airplanes have a little carbon monoxide detector. A lot of us have, some sort of electronic carbon monoxide detector as well. So that's the danger of this type of system. So that's why we need to know that. Another thing, that's very simple is just the designation of the engine. We can say it's an O320. Well, what does that mean? Oh, well, it's horizontally opposed. Okay. Well, suppose we have an IO 320. What does IO mean? Well, the I actually means fuel injected. Suppose you have a TIO. My Saratoga has a TIO 540. T stands for turbocharged. I injected, O opposed. So, if you're flying an airplane that has an IO 360, it's fuel injected. You're not going to have carburetor heat in that airplane.
And I think we talked about this one time when we talked about engines specifically, but the how could you guesstimate the horsepower based on that same designation?
Yeah, it's usually about half the displacement. So an O320 is usually 160 horsepower. 360, 180, usually.
Yep. Not always exact, but a good kind of rule of thumb that you can use.
Gets you in the ballpark.
Yeah, gets you in the ballpark. So in the systems section, I always challenge people to have they ever seen and know exactly where the cables run in an aircraft, right? Cabling is important. You probably won't ever see them unless you get really lucky and find a mechanic who's actually rewiring one or has one pulled apart for an annual inspection and is showing and looking at all the cables. But the POH has really interesting drawings from the 70s and 80s and 90s here of the ailerons, how the pulley systems worked, how they're cabled, and how they operate the aircraft all the way. And it's kind of like if you look in the POH in section 7 of a Cessna, it's on page 7.5 in this example, 7.4 and 7.5. It shows the cables running from the rudder pedals all the way back to the rudder, shows the trim tab all the way back to the trim. And you could really learn and seek to understand how these cables work throughout your aircraft without having to take the aircraft apart, and just understanding that these systems do work and how they work and could help you troubleshoot something. And there's a lot of redundancy in these systems, right? I mean, I could, in essence, probably lose my elevator cabling and then use my trim tab to have the aircraft do what I want it to do because I'm able to control that elevator. And it would be very helpful to understand the systems to be able to implement that if you had to do that one day in flight for some reason, for sure. Let's talk control locks. Does a Piper use a control lock, Wally?
For the most part, no.
Yeah. So I should have said, does a Piper Warrior have a control lock? And the answer is no, unless someone's retrofitted one or done that. So would Piper just want their ailerons and elevator whipping in the wind out there? And I ask this question a lot when we hire new line staff for the ramp, because their job at night and when they check the fleet is to make sure the control locks are installed. And sometimes they say, I put the control lock in the Warrior. And I'm like, I doubt you did. But there is a way to control lock a Piper Warrior so that the ailerons and the elevator isn't just flapping in the wind out there. Do you know how the procedure works for that, Wally?
Yeah, well, it's very simple. The seatbelt.
Yes, sir. And the POH talks about it. So you're actually supposed to wrap the seatbelts around the yoke and lock it in place, and that acts as a control lock. In a Cessna, the control lock either normally kind of goes down through the yoke. Sometimes it goes sideways through the yoke, but most of them go down through the yoke. And it's got this big flap about a foot off the piece that goes into the actual yoke, and it's got red lettering on it. It says caution, and quite often I'll open an aircraft and I will find that on the radio side of the cockpit. What value is that flap in the control lock? What's the purpose of that flap on the control lock, Wally?
Well, the purpose is to block the place where you put the key and turn on the master switch. So the purpose is to really make you think, oh, geez, that's what it wants you to do. It wants you to not be able to start that airplane up with that control lock installed. I used to work at an airport where one of the tenants in our hangar, they had their own fuel tank, and their fuel tank was on the other side of the airport. And so they had an aero commander, and their pilot used to come in, and he would get in the airplane, and he would taxi it to the other side of the airplane and fill it up with fuel. And when he would taxi it over there, he would leave the control locks installed. And there were several times where I happened to be taxiing out, and I would see it, and I would get on ground, and I would say, hey, ground, just so you know, 123 Bravo Charlie, or whatever the airplane number was, has his control locks installed. And the pilot would respond, and he was always irritated. He would say, I'm just going over to fuel the airplane. And I did it on more than one occasion, and I kept thinking, what if someday he forgot? And I'm trying to help him out, but I always thought that was just a bad technique that he used to use to tax the airplane with the control locks installed. Suppose he's taxiing out to the runway to go get fuel and thinking, oh man, it's a beautiful day. I'll go around the pattern a few times and take off, or attempt to. You wouldn't take off, but you could attempt to take off with the control locks installed.
Yeah, that would be a disaster. And unfortunately, I have read stories where those disasters have occurred, and people left the control lock in. Specifically, that flap is there to make sure you can't put the key in before removing the control lock, and that's kind of by design. So if someone puts it in backwards and covers up radio 2, that's not going to do the purpose. It's not going to supply the same purpose that it's intending to supply there, for sure.
Right.
Let's talk about, we've talked about engines, we've talked about alternators, electrical systems, and those sorts of things. Let's talk a little bit about fuel. We talked about carbureted engines and fuel-injected engines, but in a Cessna, whether it's fuel-injected or carbureted, the fuel tanks are where, Wally? Where do those fuel tanks exist, live?
Well, they're in the wing, and they're above the engine.
Yes, they are. And so it's gravity for the most part. It could have a boost pump, and then the fuel is in those tanks above your head in a Cessna again. And that fuel flow comes down through to a carburetor and then into the engine to supply the fuel to the cylinders, ultimately having to use the controls in the cockpit to make that work. We have 2 controls in a carbureted, well, I guess we have 3 controls in the cockpit. We have a primer, and what does the primer do, Wally?
It just sends raw fuel into the cylinders.
Yep, so that we can have good fuel in there for the starting mechanism, normally is where we're priming the engine. And then we also have a throttle control and a mixture control. And I think these weren't easy for me to learn. I don't think I knew them right off in the early days of my aviation time frames. The throttle control seems like it would, in essence, control fuel flow, but in essence, what does it actually control, Wally?
It's just manipulating the fuel-air mixture by controlling the air.
Yes, so a wide open throttle is turning a flap inside of a carburetor and opening it wide open so that it can pull a whole lot of air and gas into the engine and then into the intake valves, I guess. And then what is the mixture control actually? The red knob inside the cockpit, what is it controlling?
It is controlling the fuel.
Yep. So it's how rich of a flow of fuel. So all the way in is full rich, and all the way out is all the way lean, so there is no fuel, which is how we stop the engines in these aircraft as well. We pull the mixture all the way out, starving the engine of fuel. And so if you get confused on which is controlling which, remember the red knob is fuel, the black knob is the throttle, and that's actually air, and the red is fuel. It's going to control the fuel and let me get the right fuel to air mixture as well at altitude based on the POH, and all that can be found in my performance charts as well on how to get those things set up. A fuel-injected engine does not have a primer. It's got a boost pump, which you probably use to prime the engine, and the system works fairly similarly. We won't dive into all the details on an injection system, but the fuel is being put into the cylinders similarly, and you have a throttle and a mixture control there as well. Anything to add on fuel there, Wally?
No, I think we got it.
I guess the other part would be on these Piper Warriors. The fuel tanks are in the wings as well, but those wings are below you. So how does that fuel get up into the carburetor or fuel injection system, Wally?
Yeah, well, in a Warrior, in a low wing Piper, you will have, even on a carbureted low wing Piper, you will have a fuel boost pump, an auxiliary electric boost pump, I should say.
Yeah, and so what that does is because it won't flow gravity-wise, it's got something that's got to push it into the engine. And on the checklist, it has a lot of times where you turn the fuel pump on and off, the boost pump on and off. And to my ignorance early on, if I flew a low-wing aircraft, I would know that if I turn that off, something is still pulling that fuel or pushing that fuel into the engine, and that's the engine-driven fuel pump. And I have a right tank and a left tank, and most pilots use a watch, the big hand on a watch, and if it's on the big hand's on the right side of the watch, then they put fuel on the right tank, and when the big hand gets on the left side of their watch, they put it on the left side, or they start a timer and change tanks about every 30 minutes as they fly a low-wing aircraft, because the fuel pump's sucking the fuel from one side of the aircraft or the other. So that should give everybody a good idea of how the fuel systems work in these single-engine trainers. And Wally, we're out of time for this episode, so maybe we should have a part 2 of this systems episode and dive into everything that we're not getting to today.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we'll put part 2 out next week. We'll record that at another time and put systems part 2 out there. Go out and read the chapter if you're kind of between these 2 episodes. Go read your chapter and see if you can answer some of the questions we're asking each other as we put part 2 out there next week, and see if you don't know systems a little bit better at the end of all this as well. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.